I'll start by sharing you a story that happened today in our office, where Vicky and I work. One of my clients came in. He'd driven a long way from one of the regional areas, and he was a man who I'd assisted over 18 months ago to lodge an application for his wife and children. I helped him and two other friends at the same time when they were living in Wagga, and we lodged the applications all the same week in February 2013. One of the men was very lucky, and his wife's application was processed within about 4 months, and his wife and children arrived in August last year. The other two men, their wives and children still hadn't even been asked to do their medicals. So I wrote to the embassy, what's going on here? Oh, we've got a different priority processing now. Well, these applications were all lodged at the same time. No, it's different. So we waited till the end of the year, till December, and then I told the men, can't do anything till January, it's Christmas time. January, the new rules came in, new legislation. These cases wouldn't be processed any further until the sponsors had become Australian citizens. The man who came to see me today does not become an Australian citizen until November 2015. So he's got another 2-year wait until he can bring his wife and children. And he came today just to say, has anything changed? Can you help me? It's so dangerous in Quetta. Yesterday there was another 30 lives lost in a suicide bombing. He went on then to ask, what about the people on bridging visas? The man in my house woke up the other night screaming, and we went in and he's had a heart attack or something, he's in hospital, but he doesn't even know who I am now. He said, Mrs. Libby, none of us can sleep. We're all going mad. In Griffith recently, Jonathan and I have just been doing another of these regional trips. We came across a man who's got twin daughters. They're 2 years old. He hasn't seen them yet because they were born after he arrived in Australia. And he just found out that if and when he gets his visa, it will only be a temporary visa, and he will never have the right to sponsor his wife or children to Australia. His friends tell us that he just cries every day. And I'm sure you can sit there and you can feel the pain of those men. Just two of a queue of clients that we have coming into our office every day with similar sorts of stories. But it makes me look at who we are as Australians, and if these men were our neighbours, would we even be aware that they were living next door to us? Because we all have our fences, might be picket fences, iron fences, big fences, little fences, but we all have our fences around our house. And then as a nation, we've built even bigger fences around the nation by virtue of the fact that we have a sea around all our borders. And we very clearly told the world, you are not welcome here unless we invite you. So the question is, do we have the right? Is it okay to be a nation that wants to protect its sovereign borders? And when you look at the situation that happened in the middle of last year, the boats had come to a point of bringing about 3,500 people per month. That on average meant 40,000 people a year. And intelligence was suggesting it would go up to 50 or 60,000 people a year. So we had both sides of government saying we had to do something or our whole humanitarian program was going to be taken up by people coming to Australia by boat and seeking asylum. We had, again, elections that were fully focused on asylum seekers and stopping the boats and all these sorts of slogans about boat people. We had the government demonising asylum seekers again. We had the government putting up posters in countries like Pakistan saying, you are not welcome here. We had the media supporting the government's move and putting very negative pictures of asylum seekers throughout the media. We had Australian people yelling and screaming and saying, we don't want these people here, they're taking our employment, they're bringing in disease, they're Muslims, we don't want them. But on the other side, we had a growing voice of refugee activists who were calling out for calm, for compassion, calling out to treat these people with dignity. Their arguments were supported by the statistics that over 85% of the boat people were in the end recognised as refugees. It was undergirded, or their arguments were undergirded by issues that we were hearing coming out of the detention centres, including things like the death of Reza Barati at Manus Island. But the government kept claiming they were saving lives at sea. The fact that Australia is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Refugees was perhaps not ignored, but it was put to one side. Legislation became tighter and tighter as both sides of the government picked up on the Houston report, which said there should be a no advantage rule for people coming by boat. They started to tighten up the legislation even more and more, despite the fact that the United Nations said to them, there's no orderly queue in refugee camps. There's no such sort of process in the refugee camps overseas. So what do you mean by a no advantage process? That question was never really clearly answered. So the government continued with policies, firstly, that anybody who arrived by boat would be processed in an offshore detention centre and they would never be allowed to enter Australia. Then we've heard that they'll be resettled in other countries, like Cambodia. Then we heard that the people or the clients who came by boat, we were not allowed to refer to them as clients. They had to be termed illegals. The temporary protection visa was introduced, which meant these men, if they were granted refugee status, would only get a temporary visa. That visa means you can never, ever sponsor your wife and children. The number of protection visas granted each year was capped. So once that ceiling was reached, processing stopped. That's meant that this process for people could go on for years and years. And then the people, as I said earlier, that were granted, who had already been granted permanent visas and were able to sponsor their families, they suddenly found that their process was stopped and that there were different pathways they had to use and that they couldn't have their families processed until they became Australian citizens. Let me just share quickly another story. Karim is one person that's affected by these changes, or another person affected by these changes. He was recognised as a refugee in early 2010. He lodged his application for his wife and children in May 2010. He waited, they had their medicals, had their DNA tests, everything was going well. Until 2012, the government said, no, we're not using this pathway anymore, retrospectively brought in law, as they always do in immigration, and said you have to apply for a different sort of visa now, that one's going to be refused. So he came to our office, sought assistance. In 2012, in November, we lodged a partner visa for his wife and 5 or 6 children, I think he had. We expected it to move through very quickly. They'd already done their medicals. No, they had to redo their medicals. They redid their medicals. We kept waiting. November, I wrote and asked, what's happening? Still no answer. December 2013, I said to him, okay, we have to wait till January. January came. The issue of the citizenship came in, and the same week I got an email saying, my son has just been killed in a suicide bomb. You and the government are to blame. He ended up in hospital with a heart attack. He was one of the lucky ones because his citizenship was actually due, but we thought it might take 5 or 6 months, but it didn't. It just took 3 weeks because he was in a regional area. They took compassion and they pushed it through very quickly. So we sent the citizenship certificate off. The embassy seemed to be very compassionate and understanding about the situation. Still nothing's happened. Why? Because they're waiting security clearances, even though they've held that application for 4 years. They're still waiting security clearances. So then we've got those of us involved that were involved in Baxter and Woomera in the past years, in the early 2000s. We just shake our heads in disbelief as we see this whole cycle starting again. As we hear the stories of more and more suicides or attempted suicides happening in detention, as we hear stories of young kids, 4-year-olds, that have stopped talking because they can't cope with life in detention, mothers brought down to Inverbrackie without their husbands to have their children, or mothers who are only allowed to visit a sick baby in hospital for 1 or 2 hours a day, assault and rape of unaccompanied minors in Manos, and then of course the death of Reza Barati. But still, the slogan is, our policy is absolute. We are determined to stop the boats at any cost. The tragedy doesn't show that they have a failure of policy. It tells them they have in fact the very best form of deterrence. The boats have stopped. The government has saved lives lost at sea. Refugee activists are outraged, but the polls indicate that 60% of us are actually happy about the Abbott government's changes. In the 10th anniversary poll, the Lowy Institute found that 71% of the Australian public agree that the government should turn back boats when it is safe to do so. So the political truth appears to be that there's almost nothing that this government could do that the electorate would deem as too brutal. So what's happened to that Australia of a generous, compassionate nature? The Australia that likes to give people a fair go, and the Australia that responds to international crises with abounding generosity. And who are these people who've come across the seas to share our plains? Are they really presenting a great threat to our nation? Are they economic refugees, as the government says, which is a very strange term because there's actually no such thing as an economic refugee? One brief story again about Ali, a Hazara man. I don't know if you know much about the Afghans, but the Hazara are facing an ethnic and religious genocide in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ali came out last year and left his family in Afghanistan. He wasn't just fleeing because he was Hazara, but he had political opinions and also had enemies chasing him. He lost a little contact with his wife and family for some time, and then he heard from his father they had to be moved to Quetta because the enemies had found them in Afghanistan. It wasn't safe. They get to Quetta, the enemies followed them there. They abducted the 11-year-old child and said, "We'll give him back when you tell us where Ali is." Finally, the family said, "He's not here. He's not in Afghanistan. He's not in Pakistan. He's not in Iran." As a result, the body of the 11-year-old son was tossed over the fence. At that point, Ali was told, and he came to our office absolutely distraught, riddled with guilt, riddled with grief. He said to me, "I need to go back and move my family to safety. Can you help me get a visa that will allow me to go back to Pakistan to move them, and then I'll come back?" I said, "No. Once you leave the country, you'll never be allowed back in again." He said, "If I go back, I know eventually I'll be killed. I can't stay there, but I want to just move them, and then I'll come back, and at least if I can work here, I can send money to help them survive. My friends can't help me because they're too scared that the enemies will then target them." I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to say to him. I just had to tell him the truth, that if he left, he wouldn't come back. If he stayed, the visa he will get will be a temporary visa, and he'll never have the right to bring his wife and children to safety. Rami, a Sri Lankan man that I know well, he spent time on what they call the fourth floor of one of the government security offices, and that fourth floor is well known for its torture and trauma. His friend Leo killed himself last week in Geelong by setting himself on fire. Rami knows he will never go back to Sri Lanka. I don't know what will happen if his case is refused again, but he can't face the consequences of going back to torture. So these are the people that are coming on the boats. Are they the strangers at our gate? Do we welcome them here? Do we put them in a boat and send them back to Indonesia or another country? Do we abide by the UNHCR convention that we have signed as a nation, or do we protect our sovereign borders? Can we do both? And more importantly, where do we stand as Christians? What do we believe? Should we as Christians have any interest in these people? Should we speak out and have a voice? Or do we just sit back and let the world continue as it does? But we do need to ask as Christians, what would Jesus do? What would he say if he was here? Abbott is very famous for his quote that Jesus knew there was a place for everything, and it's not necessarily everyone's place to come to Australia. I think, not quite sure that the Jesus I know would have nodded his head at that one. When we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see over and over again the call for God's people to care for the poor, the oppressed, and the alien. We see in Deuteronomy, the Lord your God is God of God and Lords of Lords, the great God, mighty and awesome. He shows partiality and loves the alien. We see the Israelites reminded that to care for these people because, like you were refugees in Egypt. You were aliens in Egypt, so welcome these people who are now aliens in your land. And then we find Jesus breaking into history with the kingdom for the poor, oppressed and marginalised. From the beginning, Mary couldn't find a place to stay. A young mother having to give birth to her first child in the stable, probably her husband not present, I presume, being that culture, but fathers didn't usually hang around for the birth of the child. I can't imagine what it must have been like to have been in an strange, unknown place, amongst the hay, amongst the animals, giving birth to your first child. And then, having given birth, hearing that the leader, King Herod, wanted to kill all males under 2, and having to face that walk, that struggle through the desert to Egypt. No Coke machines on the way, no BP stations to stop off and have a wash, just heat, sand, freezing cold at night and blazing sun in the day. Then they reach Mecca, and then not Mecca, they reach their Mecca, they reach Egypt, where it's safe for them to stay for a little bit. Unlike most refugees, Jesus gets the opportunity with his family to return back to his country. But there, although the oppression and the fear of persecution had decreased, Jesus knew that it was his mission to reach out to the poor and the oppressed. In doing so, he became a leader amongst those people. He attracted the crowds. He attracted people who were against him. He taught the people that their neighbour was, as in the story of the Good Samaritan, their neighbour was the Pharisee. Don't tell us that. I mean, we despise the Pharisees. Sorry. The Samaritan. You know, we don't want to be like that. We don't want to have to love the people that we despise. But Jesus was always on that outer edge, always challenging, not being worried if he was going to be swamped with too much work. He would go out and heal, he'd go out and feed the poor, knowing that perhaps there'd be too many people, but still that didn't deter him. Still he continued on. And as he challenged people, then he became a threat to the leaders of that day. And that's what happens to so many of the refugees who arrive by boat today. Those coming from Iran, many from Afghanistan, many from Iraq, and those from Sri Lanka. Many of them are wealthy, educated people who've become a threat to the powers that be simply because they speak out against what's happening in their country. Jesus did this. The next thing, they've got false witnesses. They arrest him. They torture him. They charge him. They sentence him to death in one of the most horrific deaths that we could imagine, being stripped and hung on a cross. But then it's this Jesus that says to us, as the Father sent me, so I send you. And it's that Jesus that I have to say, if I have the stranger at my gate, if I have the Muslim living next door to me, what would Jesus say? He said, love your neighbour. And he didn't add, you only have to love them if they're persecuted Christians. And he didn't add, you can put them aside if they're gay, or you can put them aside if they're Muslim. He just simply said, love your neighbour. And go, as the Father sent me, so I send you. And I think that's hopefully our challenge tonight as we think about who is the stranger at our gate and how should we respond.
Thank you, Libby. Well done.